All right, returning to the crisis in Sri Lanka, where army is deployed at fuel stations after protests have erupted and thousands are queuing up daily to get fuel. The country facing a foreign exchange crisis that has derailed the import of basic goods like food, medicine and fuel. And the government is in talks with the International Monetary Fund for an aid package. Well, let's go across to Anushka Wijesinha, economist and co-founder, Center for Smart Future. Thank you so much for speaking to NDTV. And, the visuals are terrible. Every day, thousands of people lining up. A few days ago, we heard of 2 elderly men even dying in those lines. How soon can Sri Lanka expect some relief?
Gargi, you're absolutely right. This is an unprecedented economic crisis and people are really struggling. There's a tendency towards violence in some petrol stations and gas queues. In terms of relief, I think that the recent Indian credit line to support purchases of petroleum products and some other essentials will provide some temporary respite over the next 1.5 months. So perhaps we may see some easing up of the scenes that we're seeing right now, but it's certainly not a sustainable fix. We have a $1 billion international sovereign bond repayment coming due in July. We are already at very low reserves, perhaps usable reserves of 3 to 4 weeks. So it's untenable that Sri Lanka would be able to use the reserves, running down the reserves to repay this bond, like was done in the January bond repayment. So I think the fact that the president has made overtures that the government would be seeking IMF support is certainly a good step, but we are far from seeing this crisis solved.
And that's something that they had been resisting, seeking, this assistance from the IMF. And, worry for India because already there are reports of migrants trying to flee from the situation in Sri Lanka, arriving in India. They've been picked up by the Coast Guard. So that just gives you a sense of just how bad it is. And so all of this crisis was brought on also by, these last 2 years of COVID and lockdown and the lack of tourism.
So let's be clear, Gargi. Certainly, the impact of COVID-19, which affected domestic economic activity, it had to increase the budget because the government had to spend on healthcare and relief. The fact that tourism, which is a very large income earner, virtually collapsed. And our migrant workers who provide remittances, that's a big part of covering the import bill. A lot of migrant workers had to return to Sri Lanka as the main markets in the Middle East and in Europe closed down. So certainly COVID aggravated the situation and an already precarious macroeconomic climate was made worse. But Sri Lanka's macroeconomic troubles predate that. In fact, one of the big turning points was when there was a dramatic change in tax policy and tax structure following the presidential elections in December 2019. There were promises made to the electorate around tax cuts. And there were sweeping changes made, which not only reduced the rate of tax and tax collection, which was already low in Sri Lanka, but it also affected the timing of those cash flows. To give you a quick example, we had a pay-as-you-earn tax regime where money would come in monthly to the government coffers. That was completely removed and it was moved to end-of-year assessment for personal income tax. So I think the fact that we had COVID exacerbated the conditions, but Sri Lanka was locked out of international capital markets when we did these tax cuts, and the world realized that our macroeconomic condition is certainly not ideal for a sovereign debt issuer.
Right, and is it also true that changes in your agricultural policy have also led to this crisis?
Gargi, the domestic production of food has certainly been one of the drivers of the current inflation we're seeing and the shortages. Sri Lanka does both domestically produce and we import. So on one hand, we've seen with the depreciation of the rupee and global commodity price increases, the imported component of our food commodities shot up. On the domestic side, you're absolutely right. There was this failed attempt at a very quick overnight shift to organic fertilizer. And Sri Lankan farmers were not ready.
Which probably sounds great on paper, but yes, on the ground, it must be absolutely a nightmare for the farmers to suddenly have a ban on chemical fertilizers.
It absolutely was, and I think in principle it was a good idea but if it had to be rolled over a substantial amount of time. Farmers were not ready, agribusinesses were not ready, so that it was almost like whiplash. And we're seeing it in some of our key crop exports like tea, where the tea production has collapsed to a decade low. So certainly food prices, both from the imported food cost escalation as well as through the shortages. Now, one can be optimistic that because this ban has now been reversed, if the foreign exchange, the dollar position allows, I think slowly we will see fertilizer imports coming in. And also one hopes that the weather conditions through the rest of the year might be more favorable to help some pickup of domestic food. But inflation is now at over 15%, and that's certainly making the current conditions very, very hard for folks living on the margins.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Wijesinha, for joining us on the program. So, crisis there in Sri Lanka, that economic crisis, and as we said, a concern